Hello and welcome to my second video. So in this video today we're going to be focusing on this guy here, that is Richard II, King of England from 1377 all the way up to 1400. Now if you were eagle-eyed you might have noticed that he was actually only born in 1367. So Richard II becomes King of England at the young age of only 10 years old. So Richard II, he is the grandson of Edward III. He is the son of Edward the Black Prince, who we talked about both of them in our last video. And he becomes king straight after Edward III, so the throne passes directly from Edward III to Richard II. Miss out Edward the Black Prince because he dies of dysentery before his father dies. So we now have a young boy, aged 10, on the throne. He's expected to be King of England. And what we've got now is something called a minority government. So I will actually write this down because this is a really, really important phrase, and it will become useful when we look at the Tudors as well. So I'm going to move this over here just so you can see a little bit better. There we go. Ooh. Okay, so we've got a minority government now under Richard II. And when I say minority government, I don't mean in the terms that we would mean today, like with a parliament, where one party is kind of leading a minority government or coalition government. I mean it in the sense of a king or a monarch who is in their minority. They're not old enough yet to rule on their own. They're not sort of sophisticated enough, they're not mature enough to be able to make decisions, that kind of thing. So what this means is that a regency council is set up to help the king. And the regency council is strongly influenced by John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. So I've kind of moved Thomas of Woodstock slightly off. I'll show you where he is for a sec. That is Thomas of Woodstock there, Thomas Duke of Gloucester, and John of Gaunt is here, Duke of Lancaster. He is Richard II's kind of main advisor, and he's really, really important. So they give lots of advice to the young king as he grows. Richard II is also really famous because when he was 14 years old in 1381, the Peasants Revolt actually tore through England under the leadership of Wat Tyler. And this was an uprising that kind of spread, not across all of England, but large swathes of the country. And they were rising up in protest against the poll tax. And Richard II, at the young age of 14, is actually quite magnificent at this moment because it comes to a stage where the Peasants' Revolt comes close to the Tower of London. It seems like they are posing a serious threat to the king and the government, and the 14-year-old Richard rides out to meet Wat Tyler, to meet the leader of the rebels, which goes very well, and he completely diffuses the situation, which is very impressive for so young a person. So Richard II has this kind of early moment of success and glory. But as he grows older, it becomes clear that he wanted to end the 100 Years' War with France. So Richard II, he is much more interested in cultivating or having a cultivated court with arts and culture and fashion and music and all of these things. He's not as interested in the aggressive tendencies of his father, the Black Prince, or of Edward III. He wants to end the 100 Years' War. Another thing that's worth knowing about Richard is that he is a strong believer in something called royal prerogative, which I will also write down here. So royal prerogative will come up a few times, particularly under Elizabeth I, because she's very, very keen to protect it. But royal prerogative is basically where the monarch can refuse to allow Parliament or the Privy Council to discuss something because they can say, well, it's my prerogative, it's my right as the monarch to make the decision on that, and I shouldn't have to necessarily listen to other people's advice. So he's a strong believer in this royal prerogative, the right of the royal to make the decisions. So he makes a lot of decisions, including depending on favourites. Now this was something I mentioned with Edward III, that Edward III's father, Edward II, was usurped, was deposed, because he was relying too much on these favourites. Well, Richard II is now doing the same thing. He's relying on favourites, which means that in 1387, a group of lords called the Lords Appellant, they're aristocrats, take over the government. And one of the people involved in this is a man called Henry Bolingbroke. And we'll come back to him in a sec, but it's worth remembering his name. So 1387, Lords Appellant, including Henry Bolingbroke, take over the government. 2 years later, in 1389, Richard manages to regain control of the government. However, he doesn't forget the fact that these lords have risen against him, and although Henry Bolingbroke himself manages to escape with not being punished, in 1397, so worth pointing out 8 years later, he takes revenge on the Lords Appellant, and 2 years called the Tyranny of Richard II follow, where he exiles people, he has them executed, he has them put on trial, all sorts. Then in 1398, Thomas de Mowbray makes a remark against Richard II that Henry Bolingbroke interprets to be treason, and Henry reports it to Richard II, and the two dukes agree that they're going to undergo a duel of honour. And this was actually called by Richard II, and for those of you who know your Shakespeare, this is the beginning of the play Richard II. But before it could take place, Richard II banished both men to avoid further bloodshed, and Henry's exile was even approved by his father, John of Gaunt, and this is where I might have revealed who on this timeline Henry Bolingbroke is. It is this man here, so we're going to look today at how he took the throne. So he's now been exiled by Richard II. But a year later, in 1399, his father, John of Gaunt, dies, and Richard disinherits Henry Bolingbroke. So Henry decides he's going to invade England in June 1399. He invades England, he deposes Richard II, he has himself crowned Henry IV, he is the first Lancastrian king of England, so we can see there the beginnings of the Wars of the Roses, and I'll draw a little red rose next to him, so a little red flower. So he is the first Lancastrian king of England. He's taken over, he's deposed Richard. Richard ends up in prison. Sources suggest that it was there that he was starved to death. So Richard II is no more. We have the first Lancastrian king, the son of John of Gaunt.